So today I'm going to do something that I know you have all been hoping that I will do in the past 7 years of booktube on my channel, which is review all of the books I read in secondary school. So I'm not going to do a deep dive on the Scottish school system, but for those of you who didn't go to school in Scotland and so therefore are not aware of how it works, we do 7 years of primary school from around age 4, 5 to 11, 12. Then when we're about, 12, we go to secondary school and we do that for 6 years until we graduate around 17, 18. And I'm going to review all the books that I read in secondary school. I have no idea what I read in primary school apart from Biff, Kip and Chip. Biff, Kip and Chipper. Biff, Chip and Kipper. That's the only thing I can remember, which is the books that you learn to read with. So these are actual novels, plays, all of which are actually adult literature that I studied in my English classes. So we did occasionally read books for drama, but they're not on my list. So we're just actually going to talk about the books that I read in English in secondary school, which is enough for one video. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? One thing I will say is that English was one of my favourite classes throughout school. I adored English because I loved reading. I wasn't always the best when it came to reading comprehension or close reading and sort of studying grammar. I still really struggle with a lot of sort of spelling and that kind of stuff. But I always enjoyed reading, so for that reason I always enjoyed English class because I liked analysing the texts and looking for deeper meaning and all of that fun stuff. So most of the books I read I actually got something from. There were a few outliers and we will get to those, but one of the first books I remember reading in secondary school was Macbeth, and it feels like I wouldn't have read that in first year of secondary school, so it was probably in second year, but it's just one of the earliest memories I have of really studying a piece of literature and analysing it and learning to appreciate that book on a whole new level because of that analysis and that studying it and discussing it and writing an essay on it. And I even remember writing an essay on, is Macbeth evil? Yeah, it's the timeless question. I think I must have been around 13. And just found that such a fascinating experience. And for that reason, Macbeth has always remained one of my favourite Shakespeare plays. It was the first one I ever read, and that was the context in which I read my first ever Shakespeare play. And actually, still to this day, most of the Shakespeare I read was because of school, and I'll get onto a couple that I read later on. I'm trying to widen my Shakespeare horizons these days and read a little bit more because I generally had pretty positive experiences with him when I was a teenager. So for that reason, I'm trying to read more. But Macbeth always stuck with me. I mean, it's one of his most famous plays for a reason, right? It is such a piece of craftsmanship. I think all the clever wordplay with the prophecy surrounding Macbeth really appealed to me as a young reader. The magic of the witches, again, it just drew me in even as a young reader, and I just thought it was really fascinating, the kind of ambiguity of the characters and the pretty evil actions that they commit, regardless of whether we're going to define them as evil or not. As well as so many classic lines like "out damned spot," which stayed with me forever and pop up in popular culture. And it's nice getting those references. So I loved studying Macbeth to this day. Such a positive experience. Would like to go back and actually reread Macbeth. I've seen it performed once in a sort of alternative performance during the Edinburgh Fringe Festival when I was around 20, and I really enjoyed that. And I was glad that I'd read it beforehand because it got a little bit silly. It was entirely performed on a bouncy castle using blow-up swords, and there was palm trees for some reason. But they did, recite the entire play, so they stuck to the original in that sense. So I think, having studied it and read it before gave me more of my bearings when watching that performance, but I still enjoyed seeing somebody's vision of it on stage, even if it's not the traditional one. So moving on to another book I read the same year, so presumably second year, but I remember the same teacher taught me both these books, and that was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Another incredibly positive experience. Perhaps as well, the teacher that taught me these books just had a way of teaching them that really endeared them to me and made them come to life for me, which of course has an impact on you studying them. But I've always had such fond memories of Mice and Men. Again, this one wasn't a play, this one was a novel, and I think it was one of the first kind of literary classics that I read, and it very much endeared me towards the genre because I really enjoyed reading it. It's such an impactful, emotional book, and those emotions still resonated with me, and I was able to sympathise with the characters as a child, essentially, slash teenager. And if you're not aware, this is a book from 1937, and it's set in America following two friends who are like travelling around looking for work on different like farmsteads to make money in America that is going through an era of depression, and people are not in the best position fiscally. It's really short, but it really packs a punch. The relationship between these two characters, the way that society interacts with them, the hopes that they latch on to get them through, and then the tragedy of what happens to them in their lives and how it all wraps up at the end. If you've read it, if you've seen the film, you will know this book, like, just so much heartache but so beautiful, and again has stuck with me to this day. And I think because I studied these books, I remember them a lot better than some of the other books I read at that age, just in my free time, which I still enjoyed, but I don't have the same vivid memories of, because I wasn't spending as much time looking them over. And I always think that's such an interesting thing about studying a piece of literature. Now, the next book on my list is Christmas Carol, which, to be honest, I don't remember as well. And I think it's because it was one of the books that we kind of read as a class in my least favourite way to consume a book, which is everybody reads a little part and where you go around the entire class. I don't know if they still do that in schools. I never thought it was a great way of getting kids to enjoy reading. But I remember doing that with this book, but I also remember we didn't spend a lot of time like analysing it afterwards. We didn't write essays on it, so it didn't continue throughout the year. It was more just of like a one-off experience where we just read this short book together over a course of time and then put it down. So it's actually to this day the only Charles Dickens I've ever read. I'm glad I've read it because there's so many film adaptations for it that I've then seen. Let's be honest, Muppets Christmas Carol, one of the greatest literature to film adaptations of all time. And again, like I said, it's a classic. I'm glad I've read it. I know the storyline. There is aspects I remember vaguely enjoying at the time, but the context in which we read it, it just never really resonated me with in the same way those other two books did. It didn't stick with me. It was just quite like a short-term experience. I don't know what star rating I would have given it when I was like 12 or 13, because I really can't remember how I responded to it, but I didn't respond to it really negatively or really positively, and there were books I studied in school that I responded to very negatively. We will talk about those. So next up is actually one that I responded to incredibly positively, and to this day is one of my favourite books, I've got to say, which is Sunset Song by Lewis Grassic Gibbon. This is the first in A Scots Queer, which is a series by Lewis Grassic Gibbon that was written in the first half of the 20th century. And I'm still kind of sad to say that I've never gotten around to reading the next two books in the Scots Queer, which is something I've always meant to do because of how much I loved Sunset Song. So yeah, maybe I will do that, hopefully one day, but it's one of my favourite pieces of literature, and it's a Scottish classic, so we were really emphasising when we studied that book of reading a classic that was set in Scotland, you know, by a Scottish author that explored like the experience of somebody living in rural Scotland in the early 20th century. So it does go over the time period of World War I, so before, during and after, and we follow the character of Chris Guthrie, who is a young woman. We follow her from being a small girl and moving to a new farm with her mother, father and younger siblings, and then her life growing up. It is a coming of age story. We follow her through her teen years and her adulthood and discovering herself as a woman, her relationship with the land, having growing up on farms, but also being quite academic and enjoying schooling and kind of considering whether she wants to move to the city and leave behind that rural life that she's grown up with, as well as how World War I impacts her life and the men in her life and the losses that she sustains. And it is stunning. Like, it is genuinely one of those beautiful, evocative books I have ever read. And I remember when I was reading it, it was so interesting because my mum had also read it when she was in secondary school, and my mum and I went to the same secondary school in Edinburgh. obviously at different times. But it's so funny to see that when she was there, 30 years earlier, she'd been studying the same book as I then was 30 years later. And the book was still relevant. It didn't feel outdated despite being a classic set in a different time period. It didn't feel like we're just studying this, it's only on the curriculum because it's always been on the curriculum. It just felt like there genuinely was a lot to say about it. And studying it taught me a lot about the structure of novels and creative things authors can do. And I just feel like I learned a lot more about the writing process and how clever authors can be. I studied it later than these other books. I was maybe like 15 when I studied this book, and I think it came at the perfect time because we also went through that time period in Chris's life, and I just loved it. Can you not tell? I loved reading and studying this book, and we spent a lot of time on it, and it really stuck with me. One book I read at the same time though, so with the same teacher at least, we studied Death of a Salesman, which I hated. Death of a Salesman, one of my least favourite books of all time, which I do find slightly surprising because usually analysing a book for me can bring out aspects of it that might endear me to it that I didn't notice on a first reading. However, I hated this book, I hated it with a passion so much. To this day, don't like it. It is such a depressing book, which is fine. You know, books can be sad and depressing. A lot of the other books on this list dealt with very serious themes, but I found it so impossible to feel sorry for the protagonist. And I felt like I was supposed to, because the book is about kind of the American dream and being defeated by life and things not really going as you expected them to, and getting older and it kind of just sucking. But I didn't like it. I hated that main character. It just felt like his circumstances were not an excuse for his behaviour or the way he treated the other people in his life, and I felt so much more sorry for his wife and his children, who he neglected and didn't really treat very well and didn't have great relationships with. He cheats on his wife, etc, etc. But it didn't feel like it was a book about them, it felt like it was this book about him. And I don't know if that was the intention. I can't remember that much about studying this book in detail, but that's what I got from it as a reader. And I then saw it as well and didn't like it. It's a play, I don't think I mentioned that. It's never worked for me, and I don't think it ever will, because it just didn't sit with me. I found it depressing and kind of boring, and nothing about it particularly endearing. So yeah, not a fan, Arthur Miller, sorry. However, we did also study The Crucible, which is another Arthur Miller play that is set during the witch trials. So it's set much earlier than Death of a Salesman, in the 1600s, and follows a community where mass hysteria takes over surrounding witch trials, and they start to accuse all these young women, and the society just kind of falls apart slightly. And I know it's inspired by Arthur Miller's contemporary experiences surrounding McCarthyism, which is when a lot of people were being brought up in the American courts accused of treason and affiliation with communism and the Soviet Union, who was obviously America's big enemy at the time, and it was based on very little evidence, and you know, it was just a complete mess of the justice system. And it did draw in a lot of creatives and artistic types that worked in the film industry and in writers, and it was sort of all about that mass hysteria, but through the exploration of witchcraft and sort of how these things happen time after time. And because of that, I think it's really interesting. I thought it was a much more compelling play. However, I did see an amateur production of it with my class that my English teacher took me to see, and that was awful. If I had just seen that and not read the book, I would not have liked it. I kept falling asleep and then being rudely awoken by screaming from the amateur acting. Amateur plays and performances can be incredible. I've seen some amazing ones. This was just not one of them. I'm actually not mentioning the poetry I read from school in this video because we never read a collection of poetry. We would just read individual poems really and analyse them, and I can't remember a lot of the specific poems we looked at, although I remember we did look at poets like Sylvia Plath and Carol Ann Duffy. So now I'm moving on to the 4 books I studied in detail for my advanced higher, which I took in my final year of secondary school, and it was a pretty elective course in the sense that it didn't really contribute to the grades I needed for university. It was something extra to do when you'd kind of completed the standard English course. It's so hard for me to explain because I know it's not the same system as anywhere else, and I think it's different now since I left secondary school. But basically, I just wanted to keep studying English because I really enjoyed it, and Advanced Higher supposedly offered you this opportunity to study at a level closer to first year of university as preparation. Although, as you know, I did not study English literature at university, but I did apply for it and get accepted, and was torn between doing my ancient history and my English. Settled with ancient history, which I'm really pleased I did, but it was something I considered. And with that very roundabout description, let's return to the 4 books I mentioned, 2 of which were Shakespeare plays and 2 of which were Margaret Atwood novels. So we focused in on some authors that year, including Sylvia Plath, like I mentioned, although I can't remember what we read for that. And the novelist we focused in on was Margaret Atwood. And it's so interesting to me because I read 2 books by Margaret Atwood that year in class, and loved one, hated the other with a passion, which is so fascinating that an author who I have really enjoyed most of the books I've read by, I can also like vehemently hate a book by. Not just feel neutral about it, like genuinely hated reading and studying it. You're probably wondering what book that was, and that was Cat's Eye. So this isn't one I hear talked about as much as some of her other books, like of course Handmaid's Tale or Oryx and Crake or The Blind Assassin. Cat's Eye is not good, except I know lots of people do love it, but I don't. So I'm sticking with my opinion here. It's another sort of coming of age story. We follow a young girl growing up in Canada in the 20th century, in the later 20th century, and it's about her relationship with her friend, who is basically her bully, and then there's like a bit of a role reversal, so she kind of bullies her, and they just have this really tense, unhealthy friendship over years and decades, and they then don't see each other for a while, and then they kind of meet back up, and it's not a good relationship, and I just did not like the protagonist or the narrator, and I'm just that kind of reader who finds it really difficult to read a contemporary book set in a realistic setting, kind of very real, very slice of life, in which I dislike the main character and cannot find an element in them that I find endearing. I find that difficult as a reader, which is not true of everybody. And that doesn't mean I don't like dislikable protagonists. It's all about the context of which I'm reading about a dislikable protagonist, however. And like I said, that kind of slice of life book, I want an endearing character that I find myself endeared towards. Cat's Eye is not that book. I found her so irritating. I found the concept, which I know happens, but the concept of somebody who gets bullied then becoming the bully, really frustrating, which might have also been because I was not popular at school. I definitely got taken the mickey out of a lot. I didn't feel great about myself. I didn't find it a very supportive environment. I felt really uncomfortable, uncool, and like I was just sort of like singled out and picked on a lot. It wasn't as bad as a lot of people suffer from bullying, but having been in that kind of unpopular position, I found it frustrating reading about somebody who then did the role reversal and just acted negatively towards other people because of it. Because I was just like, you know how it feels. And it's interesting because obviously that was very related to the experiences I was having at the time I read the book. So what would I have thought of it if I read it as an adult? I still don't think I'd like it, but I don't know if I would have reacted as negatively to it if I had read it as an adult, as say when I read it as a child, as a teenager, because those themes really resonated with me in a negative way, and I didn't enjoy the character because of that, and therefore couldn't enjoy the book. However, we also read Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood, which I adored. I recommend this book to a lot of people, and I actually think it's also a bit of a Marmite when it comes to Margaret Atwood's work, because I know people that don't really like it and other people who've also loved it. And I know there's a Netflix adaptation which I haven't watched yet, so let me know if that's good, because I'd be interested to see what it does with the novel, because I loved it. It's inspired by a true crime story from the 1800s in Canada, following a woman or a murderess who was accused of murder, but you're never quite clear on whether she did commit the murder or not. And it does what a lot of Margaret Atwood books do, which is flip back and forward in time. So I think Cat's Eye did this. Handmaid's Tale definitely does this, where it doesn't just go chronologically all the time, it will jump backwards and forwards and have flashbacks and just be a bit loose and free with the structure and the chronology, which I quite like. And I think works when you're really trying to build up that ambiguous, did she kill this person? Is she like a murderer? Is she evil? Is she misunderstood? Is she the victim? Who is she? What's going on? And I found that really fascinating and really couldn't put this one down. It still very much falls into the category of the kind of book I like to read now, and it was probably one of the first books I read like that. And it made me want to read more Margaret Atwood. I had actually read a Margaret Atwood already before reading these two books, which was the Penelopiad. I'd read that of my own accord because my dad gave it to me, knowing I liked Greek myth and history, and it's a retelling of the Odyssey. So I'd read Margaret Atwood, already loved her. And it's interesting to think, if I hadn't read Margaret Atwood before and had a positive experience, if I'd read these two books, one which I really liked and one which I didn't like, would I have kept reading her? Or is the fact that I'd read two that I liked by her and one that I hadn't, did that make me feel more like that was the outlier? Don't know. Always interesting to wonder how just having read things at different times and different orders might have impacted your taste or what you read of an author in the future. But yeah, I found that such an interesting experience, that two books by the same author I could have such different reactions to in such a close space of time in a similar environment. However, before this video ends up 2 hours long, I'm going to move on to the last two books, which are Shakespeare plays. So the next one is The Tempest by William Shakespeare, which is another tragedy of his. And this one I enjoyed, but nowhere near as much as Macbeth. We follow a group of noblemen and royalty who are stranded on an island where a wizard or a sorcerer they had banished previously now lived with his older daughter, and everyone gets split up, and the wizard tries to take his revenge. I feel like wizard's not the right word, but I'm sticking with it. Whilst in the meantime, one of the younger members of the royalty falls in love with his daughter, and yeah, classic Shakespeare drama, to be honest. And I remember enjoying it, but it just never had that impact that Macbeth did. So I find I do compare the two in my head because I read them both in school, and one really stuck with me, whereas the other was like interesting. And again, I'm glad I've read it because I get these references that sometimes come up in like University Challenge, and I might be able to answer a question on them, which is obviously the only reason I read books, so I can answer questions on University Challenge. And yeah, I liked it, I just didn't necessarily love it or have as much to say about it. And then I read A Winter's Tale by Shakespeare, which I may be cheating by even saying that I read, because I am 90% sure that I did not read all of this. We studied it, and it was definitely part of my exam, but I have a feeling that I was not at school around the time we studied the middle act. So there's 3 acts, I think, or at least it's split into 3 bits. And from what I remember, I was in my class studying Act 1, we read it before class and we would talk about it together. And then I don't think I was in school when we were reading Act 2, so I just never bothered. And then I came back, and for some reason, rather than just reading Act 2, I just read Act 3 and studied that act with the rest of the class. And unsurprisingly, my teacher would often reference things that happened in Act 2, and I would have no idea what was going on, and I just never bothered to read that middle section. Like, I really feel like I didn't. I know it was a long time ago, and it's unlike me because I read most of the stuff I had to read for school, but I don't think I ever bothered. And what surprises me more that is I still finished the play, I just didn't read the bit in the middle. So I think I missed that whole famous bit about exit pursued by a bear, which is like one of the most quoted Shakespeare stage directions, I guess. And it's in Winter's Tale, but I don't think I read the bit that it's in. And I often think to myself I should go back and read Winter's Tale. This is interesting because it does have some Greek myth references in it, which I might appreciate more now as an adult who knows more about Greek mythology. Yeah, let me know if I should read Winter's Tale. Is it good? I think it's one of his comedies, or his like tragic comedies, from what I recall. It's like a little bit more humorous than, say, Macbeth is. But those are the plays and novels that I read and studied for school. Like I said, there was poetry dotted in amongst all of that, but it was individual poems, so I couldn't tell you what the individual poems were. And therefore I'm not going to give you any opinions on them because they'd be based on very little. But I would love to hear what you read in secondary school, high school, whatever it's called, wherever you live. Was there any books that had a big impact on you that you really enjoyed, that have stayed with you to this day? And equally, what was your least favourite book that you read in secondary school? Do let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!